Hello friends, welcome back to my channel 365 IT Pros. In today's tutorial, I'm going to talk about configuring end-user authentication for actions in an authenticated Copilot Studio bot. Authenticated Copilot Studio bot allows users to sign in and giving them access to restricted information, data, and actions. These three authentication options are available in Copilot Studio Bot. No authentication, authenticate with Microsoft, authenticate manually. No authentication means your Copilot does not require user to sign in when interacting with Copilot. Authenticate with Microsoft. This configuration automatically sets up Microsoft Entra ID as an authentication for Teams without any further configuration. It is available only with Microsoft Teams and Power Apps channel. For authenticate manually, user can sign in either with Microsoft Entra ID or any other auth2 identity provider like Google or Facebook. In case if you are not familiar with these options and difference between them, you can refer a link in description to know more about them and when to use which one. For this tutorial, we are strictly going to talk about authenticated Copilot, that's option 2 and 3. Before we deep dive into configuring end-user authentication, in case if you are not familiar with what is action in Copilot Studio, you can refer link in description. Actions in Copilot Studio are wrapper around API that allows Microsoft Copilot Studio, Microsoft Power Automate, and Microsoft Power Apps to talk to underlying service or APIs. Connectors from Microsoft Power Platform can be used as an action in Copilot Studio, either pre-built connector action or custom connector actions. When creating Copilot Studio, the question is what credential I want to use to connect to API. Do I want to use credential of logged in user, or do I want to use the credential which is set up by Copilot author? When creating Copilot Studio action for an authenticated Copilot Studio project, you can either supply end user authentication, performing operation by impersonating user, or you can supply set of credential for the Copilot to use on behalf of the user. This can be service account or service principal name or credential of a user authoring the Copilot itself. How end user connection works. When you enable end user authentication, users are prompted when they reach a chat conversation to enter credential and create connection. When user review connection page, they can see the connection they need to configure for an action to complete given chat. They can also see other connections your actions may require in entire chat experience. Once connection is established, returning to conversation with Copilot allows user to retry the action. It then completes with end user conversation. Now let's build a Copilot and see how it works. I am into my Copilot Studio environment with a fresh new user interface. I have already created a Copilot called Demo Copilot 1. For this particular demo, I am going to create a new item in a SharePoint list using a create item pre-built connector action. Also, for this particular bot, I am using authenticate with Microsoft Authentication. There are two places where you can create the new action and configure end user authentication for it. Let me show you via Action tabs first. Under Actions tab, click on Add an Action. Search for a pre-built action called Create Item. Create Item SharePoint. What it does is it creates a connection to the SharePoint connector using my credentials. This will take a moment to establish a connection with SharePoint. Now right here you can see an option to configure end user authentication configuration. There are two values, user authentication and Copilot author authentication. By default, the value is user authentication. You can click on next. You can set the input and output parameters and then configure this particular action. Let me show you configuring the same action via topics. We'll go to topics. I'm not using dynamic chaining generative AI for this particular demo, as there is some issue with generative AI dynamic chaining. So we will use topic with a trigger phrases. I have already created a topic called create item. This topic uses a trigger based on phrases like create item, new SharePoint item, new item. You can add a new node, call an action, search for create item, under connector. Again, I'm selecting the same pre-built connector action. Now again, it is establishing a connection with SharePoint. Once the connection is established, you can click on submit. Now, once you have added this particular connector action, you can configure end user authentication right here in properties. This will take a moment to configure this action. So you can click on properties. Right here it shows end user authentication, and Copilot author authentication. When it is set to user authentication, it will ask each user to create new connection using their own credentials when they encounter this action during the conversation with bot. It will redirect user to connection page to either create or use existing connection. Once the connection is created, it performs the operation under the context of logged in user. You will see it in a moment. While Copilot author authentication, it performs operation under the context of credential supplied by author of this Copilot. So right now, it uses the credential which are configured for this particular connection reference. If I use Copilot author authentication, I will leave it to the user authentication for now. Note that Copilot Studio does not store any credentials provided during user authentication. It reprompts end user for connection if connection is expired or revoked. Also, user can manually access connection page and refresh or revoke permission once done talking with Copilot. Let me test this bot and show you working. I'm going to say hi. I will say create new item. Now, since I have configured user authentication, it is going to ask me to create a new connection with SharePoint. I'll click on connect. It's going to open a new window where I can create a new connection. You can click on gear icon. It is setting up a connection with a SharePoint connector using my credential. Submit. The status will change to connected. I can close this. I can come back and I can click on retry. And it says new item with ID 35 is created by Samir Pathak and logged in user is Samir Pathak. I'll go to SharePoint site. You can see an item with ID 35 created by Samir Pathak. I have published Demo Copilot 1 and it is available to my colleague Amy Adams in Teams, who is logged in into the Teams in browser. And she has added this bot as an app. Now let's see what happens when she tries to create a new item. Since I have configured user authentication, she has been asked to create a new connection. It opens a new window where she needs to create a connection with SharePoint connector. This will take a moment. You can click on gear icon. It's going to establish a connection. Now a connection has been established. She's going to click on submit. Going back to bot in Teams, retry, and you see a message, new item with ID 36 is created by Amy Adams and logged in user is Amy Adams. Going back to SharePoint site, here you can see a new demo item created by Amy Adams. Now let me go back to Copilot Studio and change the user authentication to Copilot author authentication. I'll go back to my topic, create item. We'll click on properties. We'll change from user authentication to Copilot author authentication. Save the topic. I'm going to publish. The bot has been published. Now let's go back to Amy's account and see what happens. I'm again back in Teams using Amy's account and chatting with Demo Copilot 1. I'll say create new item. Now you can see the new item is created with ID 37, but instead of Amy, it is created by Samir Pathak. However, the logged in user is Amy Adams. Let's go back to SharePoint site and see SharePoint item. I'm into a SharePoint site and you can see a new demo item again created by Samir Pathak with ID 37. Though the logged in user was Amy Adams, the entire operation was performed using the Copilot author account. Amy was not asked to create any connection this time when user authentication was set to Copilot author authentication, because it was using the credential supplied by Copilot author, which can be service account. Now question is, when to use user versus Copilot author authentication? You can select Copilot author authentication if access to the service is associated with an action which is an implicit or for a low risk use case. For example, use this authentication setting to find company holidays based on location supplied by user, or when user do not have direct access to data but you still want user to perform operation via bot. Select user authentication if you must restrict the data access to a specific groups or individuals. Use this authentication setting if the Copilot is meant to retrieve data that is only to the end user has access to, or to perform the work on behalf of logged in user. That's all. Hope you like content of this video. If you like my videos, please share and subscribe to this channel. Thank you.